Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. In the vast, silent chambers of the northern palace, Queen Elara stood before a looking-glass framed in gilded silver. The reflection that stared back was that of a stranger robed in midnight blue silk, her form a lonely silhouette against the cold, stone walls of a life she had not chosen but had vowed to endure. 7 years. It had been 7 years since she had been bound in a marriage of state to King Theron, a man as remote and formidable as the snow-capped mountains that guarded their kingdom of Eredor. The union was a strategic masterpiece, a treaty sealed in flesh and blood, yet their shared bed remained a cold, barren landscape. Her handmaiden, Lyra, fussed with a stray auburn curl that had escaped Elara's intricate braid. "You are a vision, your majesty," Lyra murmured, her voice a soft, reverent whisper. "The moon itself envies your grace." The compliment, though kindly meant, landed like a stone in the hollow chambers of Elara's heart. Grace was a poor substitute for the one thing she craved with a desperate, all-consuming ache, a child. An heir to fill the echoing silence of the castle and perhaps, to bridge the chasm that lay between her and the king. But the court had already passed its verdict, their whispers rustling through the corridors like dry, dead leaves. The Barren Queen. The words were a brand upon her soul, a constant reminder of her perceived failure. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windowpanes, heralding the arrival of her sister, Princess Isolde. Where Elara was all quiet dignity and measured calm, Isolde was a tempest of fiery passion and untamed magic. She swept into the room, her crimson gown a splash of vibrant defiance against the somber tapestries. In her hands, she clutched a small, crystal vial filled with a shimmering, silver liquid. "I brought you something," Isolde announced, her voice alive with a conspiratorial urgency. She pressed the vial into Elara's hand. "It's a fertility elixir, from the sunken coven in the southern marshes. Old magic, powerful and true." Elara's fingers closed around the cool glass. She gazed at the swirling contents, a potent, dangerous hope stirring within her. But she quickly suppressed it. "Isolde, we have discussed this. The problem is not of the body." Her voice was barely a whisper, the admission of familiar shame. "The king. We do not share a bed. Not in the way that matters." The truth was a delicate, intricate architecture of unspoken rules and political necessity. Their marriage was a performance, a carefully constructed illusion of unity for the good of the realm. A living heir was the final, crucial piece of that illusion, the one thing they had failed to produce. Theron kept his distance, a chaste and disciplined monarch whose reasons were shrouded in a mystery as deep and impenetrable as the ancient forests that bordered their kingdom. His restraint felt less like cruelty and more like a form of penance, a self-imposed exile within the very walls of his own palace. "Then we shall force the matter," Isolde declared, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. "You cannot continue like this, Elara. A ghost in your own home, fading with each passing moon. You deserve happiness. You deserve to be a mother." Elara shook her head, a sense of weary resignation settling upon her. "It is not that simple. To use magic to compel him? It is a violation, Isolde. A betrayal of the trust our people have in us." "And what of the violation of your heart?" her sister countered, her voice softening with a raw empathy that brought tears to Elara's eyes. "For 7 years, you have walked this path of duty with unwavering grace. You have sacrificed everything. Is it so wrong to want something for yourself? To claim the one thing that would give your life meaning?" Elara looked at her reflection once more, at the sad, lonely queen trapped in the silver frame. The desire for a child was a wild, desperate hunger that gnawed at her day and night. It was a longing that threatened to consume her, to shatter the placid facade she had so carefully constructed. She thought of the monthly ritual, the lonely walk to the king's chambers, a journey of hope that always ended in quiet despair. The kingdom needed an heir. And she, more than anyone, needed a reason to believe in a future that was not defined by loss and longing. The vial in her hand felt heavy, a tangible weight of a choice that could redeem her or ruin them all. Chapter 2. The Scent of Sleep. The monthly pilgrimage to King Theron's chambers was a ritual steeped in silent, agonizing hope. Each time, Elara would dress in her finest silks, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, a foolish, persistent prayer on her lips. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he would see her, truly see her, and the chasm between them would finally be bridged. But 7 years of disappointment had forged a fragile armor around her heart, a defense against the inevitable sting of rejection. The king's chambers were a world away from her own light-filled rooms. Here, shadows clung to the heavy, dark wood furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and something else. Something uniquely Theron. It was the scent of the wild, of pine needles and cold, clean air, a reminder of the man beneath the crown, the disciplined, almost feral mystery he so carefully guarded. The vast, canopied bed stood as a silent testament to their shared, unspoken failure, the space between them a tangible entity, a cold and unwelcome guest. As she had done countless times before, Elara approached the bed, her steps a soft whisper on the thick, woven carpets. Theron lay still, his breathing deep and even, his face turned away from her. He was a portrait of slumbering royalty, his dark hair a stark contrast against the white linen of his pillows. But as she drew closer, a familiar, cloying scent tickled her nose, a scent that always signaled the end of her hopeful journey. On the bedside table, nestled beside a half-read book of military strategy, was a small, empty vial. The dregs of a sleeping draught. The telltale sign that Theron had once again chosen oblivion over his queen, his duty. The realization was a physical blow, a sharp, cruel knife twisting in her gut. He had drugged himself to avoid her, to escape the intimate summons that their marriage demanded. A wave of pain, so intense it nearly brought her to her knees, washed over her. For 7 years, she had borne the whispers of the court, the pitying glances, the silent accusation in every smile. She had carried the burden of their childless union as if it were her failing alone. But this was a deliberate act. A choice. He did not simply tolerate their distance, he actively sought it. He preferred the sweet, dreamless void of a potion-induced sleep to the touch of his own wife. The pain did not recede. Instead, it began to change, to morph into something harder, something sharper. Grief crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard fury. It was a hunger not just for a child, but for justice, for a voice in her own destiny. She would not be the Barren Queen, the silent, sorrowful ghost haunting the halls of her own palace. She would be a mother. If the king would not give her a child, she would find a way to take one. The thought was a dangerous, thrilling heresy, a rebellion against the very foundations of her life. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up the empty vial. It was still warm from his touch. In that moment, something shifted within her. The patient, dignified queen began to recede, replaced by a woman on the precipice of a decision that could destabilize the monarchy, a woman who was willing to risk everything for the chance to hold her own child in her arms. The rift between their bodies and their duties was no longer a chasm of sorrow, but a battleground. And Elara, for the first time in 7 years, was ready to fight. She would have her heir, even if it meant shattering the gilded cage she had so long called home. The silence of the king's chambers no longer felt like a sanctuary of shadows, but the first scene of a war she was determined to win. Chapter 3. The Prince of Whispers. The grand ballroom of Eredor was a glittering sea of silks, jewels, and whispered intrigues. 1,000 candles dripped wax from ornate chandeliers, casting a warm, flickering glow on the polished marble floor where the kingdom's elite danced and schemed. For Elara, it was a beautiful, suffocating cage. Every smile seemed to hide a sneer, every polite inquiry a veiled question about the state of her womb. The court's whispers were 1,000 tiny blades, each one aimed at the fragile armor around her heart. She stood near the dais, a vision in emerald green, a faint, practiced smile on her lips. She was performing her role as queen, a gracious and serene figurehead, while inside, the fury she had discovered in Theron's chambers still simmered. It was a secret fire that warmed her against the chill of the court's judgment. A man of striking looks, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as blue as a summer sky, detached himself from a crowd of dignitaries and approached her. He bowed low, his movements fluid and graceful. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "I am Lord Kaelen, an ambassador from the Southern Isles. I bring greetings from my king." Elara inclined her head. "You are most welcome in Eredor, Lord Kaelen. Your kingdom is as beautiful as the tales suggest," he said, his eyes holding hers with a disarming intensity. "But even the most beautiful of gardens can suffer from a blight that prevents new life from blooming. The thinly veiled reference to her childlessness was a direct, audacious strike. But there was no malice in his tone, only a strange, compelling sincerity. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are ways, Your Majesty. Discreet paths to healing a marriage's breach. A physical reconciliation, a blending of lines that would finally render you a true mother and secure the succession. I could help you. A quiet arrangement, a secret that would die with us." The offer hung in the air between them, a shocking, scandalous proposition. He was offering to be her surrogate, to give her the child Theron would not. The audacity of it left her breathless. It was treason. It was madness. And yet, a desperate, traitorous part of her considered it. A child. A secret path to the one thing she craved above all else. Before she could form a reply, a shadow fell over them. A palpable chill swept through the air, silencing the whispers around them. Theron. He had moved with a silent, predatory grace, his presence a sudden, thunderous storm in the glittering ballroom. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on Kaelen, and they held a fire Elara had never seen before. "The Queen is not in need of your counsel, Ambassador." Theron's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He stepped to Elara's side, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of possessiveness that was as shocking as it was public. The weight of his touch was a brand, a claim that sent a jolt through her. He pulled her closer, his body a solid, unyielding wall against hers. "You will dance with me," he commanded, his voice for her ears alone. It was not a request. As he led her to the center of the floor, the court parted before them like a receding tide. The music swelled, and they began to move together, a reluctant, beautiful dance of silent warfare. His hand was firm on her waist, his eyes boring into hers. The disciplined mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, untamed ferocity. He was a man who would fight, who would pounce to guard what he believed was his. The ballroom, once a stage for her humiliation, had become a battleground of desire and consent. Theron's jealousy was a palpable force, a storm that unsettled the fragile balance of their carefully constructed world. For the first time, Elara realized that the distance between them was not born of indifference. It was something far more complex, a fissure of fear, duty, and a hidden violent passion that had just been unleashed. The king was not a cold, remote statue. He was a volcano, and she had just witnessed the first terrifying tremor of its eruption. The dance was no longer a performance, it was a duel, and the prize was a future she was no longer willing to forfeit. Chapter 4. A Sister's Gambit. The aftermath of the ballroom confrontation was a tempest of confusion and a strange, burgeoning hope for Elara. Theron's raw display of jealousy had shattered the image of the indifferent king, replacing it with a far more complicated and compelling portrait. He had been cold, distant, yet fiercely protective. He had claimed her in front of the entire court, a possessive act that both thrilled and terrified her. She spent the following days in a daze, replaying the moment over and over, the weight of his hand on her back a phantom touch that lingered long after he had retreated back into his customary silence. This newfound complexity, however, did little to solve the fundamental problem. The chasm between them remained, and the whispers of the court, though momentarily silenced by the king's display, would soon return. The kingdom still needed an heir, and her heart still ached with the primal, unfulfilled longing for a child. Isolde, who had watched the entire spectacle from the edge of the ballroom, was less enthralled by the romantic drama and more convinced than ever that drastic measures were required. To her, Theron's jealousy was not a sign of hidden love, but the possessiveness of a king guarding his most valuable, yet unused property. She saw Elara's renewed hope as a dangerous delusion, another turn on the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that had defined her sister's marriage. "He is a dragon guarding a treasure he has no intention of spending," Isolde argued one afternoon as they sat in Elara's private garden. "He will not let another man have you, but he will not take you for himself. It is the height of cruelty." "But you saw him, Isolde," Elara insisted, her voice soft. There was something in his eyes. Not just anger. Something more. "And what good is something more, when your bed is still cold and your womb is still empty?" Isolde's voice was sharp with a love that was as fierce as it was impatient. "Your happiness is all that matters to me. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that your happiness is a child." Convinced that Elara was incapable of taking the necessary steps, and that Theron was a prisoner of his own inexplicable vows or fears, Isolde decided to act. She believed she was acting in her sister's best interest, a magical intervention to give Elara the one thing she desired most. It was a dangerous gambit, a moral labyrinth she was willing to navigate for the sake of her sister's heart. She retreated to the hidden corners of the castle, to the ancient, dusty chambers where the royal family's collection of magical artifacts and texts were kept. There, among scrolls of forgotten spells and recipes for potent elixirs, she found what she was looking for. It was not the fertility tonic she had offered before, but something far more potent, far more morally ambiguous. It was a potion described in a crumbling, leather-bound grimoire as the elixir of primal instinct. It was not a love potion, the text was very clear on that point. It did not create desire where none existed. Instead, it was designed to strip away the complex layers of civilization, reason, restraint, guilt, and fear, and leave only the most basic primal instincts. It would not suppress a man's will, the text claimed, but rather unleash it. In a man like Theron, a man Isolde believed was bound by some rigid, self-imposed code of conduct, the potion would, in her estimation, simply remove the barriers that prevented him from claiming his wife and fulfilling his duty. Her hands trembled as she mixed the ingredients under the light of a waning moon. She told herself it was not a violation. She was not creating a false love, only removing the obstacles to a duty that should have been performed years ago. She was convinced that deep down, Theron must desire his beautiful queen, and this elixir would simply give him the freedom to act on that desire. With a heart full of desperate, misguided love for her sister, Isolde poured the colorless, odorless liquid into a decanter of the king's favorite wine, setting in motion a chain of events that would change the fate of their kingdom forever. The gamble had been made, the dice cast, and the future of Eredor now rested on the unpredictable whims of magic and a king's unleashed instincts. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. The night air was heavy and still, the moon a sliver of silver in an inky black sky. Elara, unable to sleep, found herself pacing the cold stone floors of her chambers, her thoughts a tangled mess of hope and fear. The memory of Theron's possessive grip in the ballroom warred with the 7 long years of his cold indifference. She was caught in a tormenting limbo, unsure of what to believe, of what to feel. A soft knock on her door startled her. It was Lyra, her handmaiden, her face pale and her eyes wide with an emotion Elara couldn't quite decipher. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The king. He requests your presence. In his chambers." The words were a shock, a sudden, stunning deviation from the established script of their lives. In 7 years, he had never once summoned her. It was always she who made the lonely pilgrimage to his door, only to find him lost in a potion-induced sleep. A wild, dangerous hope surged through her. Perhaps something had changed. Perhaps the confrontation with Kaelen had finally broken through the walls he had built around himself. She allowed Lyra to brush her hair and drape a silk robe over her shoulders, her hands shaking so much she could barely fasten the clasp. She walked the familiar path to his chambers, each step a mix of trepidation and soaring expectation. When she entered, she found him standing by the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. He was not in his usual sleeping attire but was fully dressed, a half-empty decanter of wine on the table beside him. He turned as she entered, and his eyes. They were different. The usual guarded, disciplined control was gone, replaced by a raw, burning intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The air was thick with a palpable tension, the scent of wine, and the primal aroma of a predator who has finally caught the scent of his prey. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that vibrated through her. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his movements fluid and purposeful. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. The touch was electric, a spark in the vast, cold emptiness of their marriage. "Theron, what is this?" she whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. He didn't answer with words. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperate, pent-up hunger, of years of unspoken longing unleashed in a single devastating moment. It was a kiss that spoke of possession, of a claim finally being made. She was swept up in the storm of it, her own desperate yearning rising to meet his. This was what she had dreamed of, prayed for for 7 long years. It was a torrent of passion that washed away the loneliness and the pain, a raw, elemental force that bound them together in the firelight. But as the initial shock receded, a small, cold splinter of unease began to work its way into her heart. This was too much, too soon. The transition from icy distance to raging inferno was too abrupt. There was a wildness in his eyes, a lack of the control that had always defined him. This was not the Theron she knew, the man who chose sleeping draughts over her touch. The encounter that followed was a blur of passion and confusion, a fulfillment of her deepest desires tainted by a growing sense of wrongness. In the aftermath, as she lay beside him in the vast, canopied bed, the silence that fell was not the peaceful quiet of intimacy, but the heavy, charged silence of unspoken questions. It was then that she saw it. The decanter on the table, the same one from which Isolde had offered her a glass of wine earlier that evening, claiming it was a special vintage to calm her nerves. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. The fertility tonic. The strange taste of the wine. Isolde's fierce, protective love. The wild, uncharacteristic abandon in Theron's eyes. What did she do? Elara whispered, the words a ghost of a sound in the quiet room. Theron, his breathing slowly returning to normal, looked at her, a dawning confusion in his own eyes as the fire began to recede, leaving a bewildered, troubled man in its wake. The realization hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. This was not a reconciliation. It was not a breakthrough. It was a violation. A trick. Her sister had not just offered magic, she had used it. The culmination of her deepest desires had been born not of love, but of a lie. The joy and relief that had filled her heart only moments before curdled into a bitter, agonizing betrayal. The foundation of their world had just been irrevocably fractured, and in the ruins of their carefully constructed lives, a new terrible drama was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Bitter Draught of Truth. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room that seemed to mock the fragile intimacy of moments before. The warmth of Theron's body beside her was no longer a comfort, but a searing brand of deception. Elara pushed herself up, pulling the silk sheet around her like a shield, the soft fabric a flimsy barrier against the brutal, unraveling truth. It was the wine, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, a chillingly calm surface on a sea of turmoil. She looked at the decanter, then at Theron, whose face was a mask of growing confusion and a dawning horror. The wine, he repeated, his own voice rough, as if scraped raw. He sat up, the powerful muscles of his back tense. The primal haze was clearing from his eyes, replaced by the sharp, analytical mind of the king she knew. What are you saying, Elara? My sister, Elara's voice broke, the single word a shard of glass in her throat. She gave me a glass of wine before I came here. She said it was to calm my nerves. But it was for you, wasn't it? It was in this decanter all along. She dosed you. Like an animal to be bred. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Theron's eyes widened, following her gaze to the decanter. He seemed to recoil from it, a wave of revulsion and understanding crashing over him. He looked from the decanter back to her, and what she saw in his face was not the lingering heat of passion, but a profound, soul-deep shame. The ferocity was gone, leaving behind a vulnerability she had never witnessed. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, that's not. I would never. But you did, she shot back, the dam of her composure finally breaking. A torrent of heartbreak and fury poured forth. For 7 years, Theron. 7 years of sleeping draughts and silence. You chose to drug yourself rather than touch me. And now this? This frenzy? You cannot tell me this was a choice. It was magic. A coercion. My own sister, using a potion to force my husband to his duty. The truth, as she spoke it, was a poison, tainting the one thing she had craved most. The child she might now carry would not be a symbol of love, but a product of manipulation. Her body felt violated, her deepest desires twisted into a grotesque parody. It wasn't a love potion, Theron said, his voice urgent, desperate. He reached for her, but she flinched away, and his hand dropped as if burned. Elara, you must believe me. It didn't create this. He gestured between them, to the rumpled sheets of the bed. It only tore down the walls. "What walls?" she cried, tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her face. "The walls you so carefully built between us? The ones that labeled me the Barren Queen in my own court? The walls I built to protect you?" he thundered, his voice cracking with a pain that mirrored her own. The outburst seemed to surprise even him. He took a deep breath, his gaze locked on hers, pleading for her to understand. "I made a vow, Elara. A vow upon my father's grave. I saw what a political marriage did to my mother. I saw her fade away, a prisoner of duty, bound to a man she did not choose. I swore I would never do that to my own wife. I would never claim a woman who did not want to be claimed." The confession was so unexpected, it momentarily silenced her tears. "I watched you," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper. "You were so dutiful, so perfect. You came to my chambers every month, your face a mask of serene acceptance. I saw no desire, Elara. Only a queen performing her role. I believed you felt trapped, and I couldn't bear to be your jailer. The sleeping draughts, they were not to escape you. They were to escape myself. To quell what I felt, what I wanted, because I believed it was a desire you did not share. I chose my honor over my heart, every single night for 7 years." The room was silent save for the crackle of the dying fire. His words were a cataclysm, shattering the very foundation of her misery. His distance had not been a rejection of her, but a misguided, agonizing act of protection. He had seen duty in her eyes, when all she had felt was a desperate, unrequited longing. The potion had not created his desire, it had merely unleashed it from the cage of his own making. The truth did not heal the wound of the night's events, but it transformed it. The bond between them had not just been formed and then fractured. It had been a lie from the very beginning, a tragedy of misinterpretation and silent, noble intentions that had caused immeasurable pain. She looked at the king, her husband, and for the first time, she saw the man, heartbroken and exposed, and realized they were both prisoners of the same gilded cage. Chapter 7: The Silence of the Stone. The dawn that followed was cold and grey, the pale light filtering through the arrow-slit windows of the castle like a judgment. The passion of the night had evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, brittle silence. Elara had returned to her chambers before the first servants began to stir, the vast bed in Theron's room feeling more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The chasm between them had not been bridged, it had simply been revealed to be a far deeper and more treacherous canyon than she had ever imagined. She felt hollowed out, betrayed on 2 fronts. Theron's confession echoed in her mind, a painful testament to 7 years of tragic misunderstanding. But the deeper, sharper wound was Isolde's deception. Her sister, her confidant, the one person she trusted implicitly, had orchestrated this violation. Love had been her motive, but the outcome was a ruin. She found Isolde in the castle solarium, tending to her collection of exotic, sun-loving plants. Her sister looked up as she entered, a hopeful, expectant smile on her face. "Elara, did it work?" The innocent anticipation in her sister's voice was like a lit match to Elara's raw nerves. "Work?" Elara repeated, her own voice dangerously quiet. "You mean did your potion succeed in turning the king of Eredor into an animal, stripped of his will and reason? Did your magic violate the sanctity of my marriage bed and turn my deepest wish into a sordid transaction?" "Yes, Isolde. It worked perfectly." Isolde's smile faltered, her face paling as the weight of Elara's words landed. I didn't mean. I thought it would just remove his inhibitions. I read the texts. It wasn't supposed to compel him, only to free him." "And you decided you had the right to free him?" Elara's voice rose, trembling with a fury born of profound hurt. "You took that choice away from both of us. You played God with our lives, with the future of the kingdom, all because you decided you knew what was best for me." Tears welled in Isolde's eyes. "I just wanted you to be happy. I couldn't bear to see you so sad, so empty. 4 years, I've watched you wither in this castle. I thought a child would save you. A child conceived in a lie." Elara's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "What you have done is unforgivable. You have broken something between us, Isolde. Something I don't know if I can ever repair." She turned and walked away, leaving her sister standing amidst her beautiful, sun-drenched plants, weeping. The bond that had been her anchor her entire life was now fractured, perhaps irrevocably. For days, the castle was cloaked in a suffocating tension. Elara confined herself to her rooms, refusing all visitors, including the king. Theron sent messages, pleading for a chance to speak, to explain further, to simply be in her presence. She refused them all. She could not face him. To look at him was to be reminded of the magic-fueled passion, the deception, and her own crushing part in their shared tragedy of errors. His misguided honor felt as cruel as any deliberate neglect. Theron, in turn, was consumed by a guilt that was a palpable force within the castle walls. He had lost control. The vow he had guarded with such iron-willed discipline for 7 years had been shattered in a single night. He felt as though he had failed his honor, failed his father's memory, and most of all, failed Elara. He retreated into his duties with a grim, relentless focus, his council meetings longer, his training sessions in the yard more brutal. But the lords and servants whispered among themselves. The king was a thundercloud, his temper short, his eyes haunted. The silence between the king and queen was no longer a quiet, accepted fact of court life, it was a cold, raging war that everyone could feel. The heart of the kingdom had stopped beating, and in its place was a cold, silent stone. Chapter 8. The First Flutter. Weeks bled into one another, each day marked by the same oppressive silence. Elara moved through her life like a phantom, her interactions with the court polite but distant, her smiles as thin and fragile as winter ice. The rift with Isolde was a constant, aching void. They saw each other at formal meals, 2 remote islands of misery, their shared history a chasm between them. The vibrant, fiery connection that had once defined them was gone, replaced by stilted pleasantries and averted gazes. Then, one morning, the world shifted. It began with a familiar wave of nausea, a weariness in her bones she initially dismissed as a symptom of her sorrow. But when the sickness persisted for a week, a dawning, terrifying, and exhilarating possibility took root in her mind. Her monthly courses, always as predictable as the tides, were late. With trembling hands, she summoned the royal physician, a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes who had served her family for decades. He asked his questions quietly, his examination was discreet, and when he was done, he looked at her with an expression of profound, respectful joy. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," he said, his voice soft. "You are with child." The words landed not with a crash, but with a quiet, earth-shattering tremor. A child. The thing she had yearned for, prayed for, despaired over for 7 agonizing years. It was real. A new life was growing inside her, a tiny, persistent miracle born from a night of magic and misunderstanding. Joy, fierce and undeniable, was her first reaction. It was a sunbeam piercing through the storm clouds of her grief, a pure, elemental happiness that had nothing to do with kings or potions or sisters. It was the primal joy of a mother. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile touched her lips. But the joy was immediately followed by a wave of complex, conflicting emotions. This child was a living reminder of Isolde's betrayal and Theron's loss of control. Its conception was tainted, a secret that would forever lie at the heart of their family. How could she celebrate a beginning born from such a painful end? The news, however, forced her to look outward, beyond the walls of her own misery. She had to tell Theron. He was the father. This child, this tiny, fluttering hope, belonged to them both. From the privacy of her window, she began to watch him. She saw him in the training yard, his movements with a sword not angry, but precise and full of a deep, sorrowful control. She saw him in the gardens, standing before a bed of winter roses, his expression lost and lonely. He was not just a king wrestling with his honor, he was a man consumed by remorse. One afternoon, she returned to her chambers to find a single, perfect white camellia in a crystal vase on her writing desk. There was no note. The next day, a small leather-bound volume of poetry appeared on her bedside table, its pages filled with verses of longing and regret. These were not grand royal gestures, but small, quiet acts of penance. They were Theron's desperate, silent apologies, a plea for forgiveness he didn't know how to speak aloud. She began to see that his pain was as deep as her own. He was trapped by the consequences of a night he had not chosen, just as she was. They were inextricably linked now, not just by a crown and a broken vow, but by the undeniable, living truth of the child they had created. One evening, as she sat reading the book of poetry he had left, she felt it. A tiny, barely perceptible tremor deep within her. A flutter. It was so faint, she almost thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, a delicate, insistent tapping, like the wings of a captured butterfly. It was her baby, announcing its presence, a tiny life demanding to be acknowledged. In that moment, the bitterness began to recede. This was not a symbol of a lie. This was her child. And he, or she, deserved a father. The stone wall around her heart did not crumble, but a single, small crack appeared, letting in a sliver of light. Chapter 9. A Fragile Truce. The first flutter of life inside her was a catalyst. It was a tangible presence that demanded more than silent suffering and cold resentment. This child deserved a family, not two warring monarchs ruling separate, lonely kingdoms within the same castle walls. Swallowing her pride, which tasted much like grief, Elara sent a message to the king. A single sentence, carried by a trusted page: "I will speak with you in the library after the evening meal." The royal library was neutral ground. It was a vast, quiet space filled with the accumulated knowledge of centuries, smelling of old paper and beeswax. It was a place of thought, not passion, and it felt like the only room in the castle where they might be able to find their way back to some semblance of civility. He was already there when she arrived, standing near a tall window overlooking the moonlit gardens. He turned as she entered, his face etched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He looked tired, the weight of the crown and his guilt seeming to press down on him. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a pang of empathy. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and steady, though she could see the tension in his hands. "We have something we must discuss," she replied, her own voice cooler than she intended. She gestured to two high-backed chairs near the unlit hearth. "Our child." He nodded, his throat working. "Elara, before we speak of the future, I have to try and make you understand the past. I know an apology is not enough. Words cannot undo what happened." She waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He didn't sit. He began to pace, the words pouring out of him as if a dam had finally broken. "My mother was a princess from a sun-scorched land, married to my father to secure a trade route. She was a vibrant, joyful woman, but this northern court, this duty, it was a cage for her. My father was not a cruel man, but he was a king first. He saw her as his duty, his queen, the vessel for his heir. He never saw her. I watched her spirit dim and then extinguish over the years. She died when I was 16, not of illness, but of a sorrow so deep it simply stopped her heart." He paused, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. "I stood at her grave and swore an oath. That I would never be the man my father was. I would never chain a woman to my side with duty. When our marriage was arranged, I saw her in you. I saw another beautiful, vibrant woman being sacrificed for politics. And I swore I would not be the lock on your cage." His voice was raw with the pain of the memory. "My distance, my damnable, stupid honor. It was all for you. I thought I was giving you freedom. I thought by keeping myself from you, I was allowing you to remain whole, to not be just another queen consumed by her duty to the crown. I desired you from the moment I first saw you, Elara. It has been a constant, private war within me for 7 years. A war I lost the moment your sister's potion tore down my defenses." He finally turned to face her, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I am not asking for forgiveness, because I do not deserve it. I failed you. My attempt to be honorable was, in itself, a form of cruelty. I only ask that you believe me. The desire was real. It has always been real." His confession laid him bare. The proud, remote king was gone, replaced by a man haunted by his mother's ghost and crippled by a noble, misguided vow. She saw the truth of it in his anguished eyes, heard it in the broken cadence of his voice. He had not rejected her, he had been trying to save her, in the only way he knew how. "I wanted you too, Theron," she whispered, the admission a quiet revelation in the silent library. "From the very beginning. What you saw as duty was hope. Every month, I hoped you would see me. The real me. A fragile, tentative understanding began to dawn between them. The foundations of their relationship had been built on a tragedy of misperceptions. He thought he was protecting her freedom, she thought he was repulsed by her. Now, in the wreckage of that misunderstanding, something new and incredibly fragile was beginning to grow. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something far more delicate, a truce. A shared, painful truth that might, if they were careful, become the foundation for something real. The silence between them was no longer a weapon, but a space waiting to be filled. Chapter 10. The Shadow from the South. In the weeks that followed their truce in the library, a delicate new rhythm began to establish itself within the castle. The oppressive silence was replaced by a tentative curiosity. Theron and Elara started taking their evening meals together, not in the cavernous dining hall surrounded by the court, but in a small, private chamber. Their conversations were stilted at first, circling around safe topics, matters of state, the changing seasons, the history of the books in the library. But slowly, carefully, they began to share pieces of themselves. He spoke of his childhood, of the pressure of being heir. She spoke of her home in the warmer, sunnier clivages of the kingdom, of her wild, magical sister, a topic that still brought a shadow of pain to her eyes. Theron was unfailingly gentle. He would pull out her chair, ensure her glass was filled with spiced cider instead of wine, and often, his hand would brush hers as he passed her a plate, a fleeting touch that sent a surprising warmth through her. He was learning to be a husband, and she, in turn, was learning to see the man he had kept hidden for so long. The bond between them was no longer a political alliance or a magical mistake. It was a fragile seedling of mutual respect and burgeoning affection, nurtured by the shared secret and the promise of the child she carried. This tentative peace, however, was destined to be short-lived. A raven arrived from the southern coast, bearing the seal of the Sunken Isles. It announced the impending arrival of a delegation led by Lord Kaelen, ostensibly to discuss the renewal of a trade agreement that was vital to Eredor's economy. The name alone was enough to send a chill through Elara. She remembered Kaelen's predatory blue eyes in the ballroom, his audacious and insulting offer whispered behind a silken fan. His presence was an unwelcome specter from a past she was desperately trying to leave behind. Theron's reaction was immediate and stark. His jaw tightened, and the easy warmth that had begun to soften his features was instantly replaced by the cold, hard mask of the king. "He is bold," Theron said, his voice a low growl as he read the missive. "To return here after his insolence." "His visit is about trade," Theron, Elara said, trying to soothe the protective anger she saw rising in him. "It is a matter of state." "With Kaelen, everything is a matter of power," he corrected her grimly. "He smells weakness like a shark smells blood in the water. And whispers of a rift between the king and queen of Eredor have no doubt reached his shores." His words were prophetic. When Lord Kaelen and his entourage arrived, he was all charm and diplomatic grace, but his eyes missed nothing. He noted Elara's barely concealed pregnancy, the new, quiet intimacy between her and Theron, and the way the king's hand instinctively went to the small of her back whenever Kaelen drew near. During a tense council meeting to discuss grain tariffs and shipping lanes, Kaelen steered the conversation with a subtle, venomous skill. "We were all so thrilled in the Isles to hear the joyous news," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes as he looked directly at Elara. "After so many years, the announcement of a royal heir is truly a miracle. One might almost think it an act of divine, or perhaps magical, intervention." The silence in the council chamber was deafening. The barb was unmistakable, a poisoned arrow aimed directly at the heart of their new, fragile trust. It was a clear threat. He knew something or suspected it, and he was not afraid to use it as leverage. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. But before her fear could take root, Theron stood. He did not shout or draw his sword. His fury was a cold, controlled force, more terrifying than any outburst. "Lord Kaelen," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "The conception of my heir is a matter between my wife, my god, and myself. I would advise you to confine your remarks to the price of wheat, lest you find Eredor's hospitality has its limits." He then turned his gaze to Elara, and across the long, polished table, a silent pact was formed. It was a look of complete solidarity, of unwavering support. "We are in this together." For the first time, They were not just a king and queen, but a team, a united front against a common enemy. The shadow from the south had come to exploit their weakness, but in doing so, it had inadvertently forged their alliance in steel. The true battle was just beginning, and they would face it together. Chapter 11, The Unseen War. The moment the council chamber doors closed behind them, the rigid mask of royalty fell from Theron's face. He led Elara not to their separate chambers, but to a small, private study adjoining the library, a room filled with maps and astronomical charts where the king, not the crown, came to think. The air was still thick with the lingering chill of Kaelen's veiled threat. "He knows nothing," Theron said, his voice a low rumble of contained fury. He poured 2 goblets of water, his movements precise and controlled, betraying the storm raging within him. "He suspects, and he hopes. Kaelen thrives on chaos. He is a scavenger who circles, waiting for the strong to falter." Elara took the goblet, her fingers cold against the silver. "Why is he so bold? He is an ambassador, not a conqueror." Theron's gaze met hers, and in their depths, she saw a history she was not privy to. "Before my father arranged our marriage, there were other possibilities. Kaelen's sister was offered. The Southern Isles are rich, but their bloodline is thin and their claim to royalty is tenuous. A marriage to the throne of Eredor would have legitimized them for a generation. My father refused. He saw their ambition for what it was, a viper seeking a warm place to nest. Kaelen has never forgiven the slight. He sees you, our marriage, as a personal insult." The revelation cast Kaelen's actions in a new, more sinister light. This was not just political maneuvering, it was a vendetta. He was not just attacking the crown, he was attacking her. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over her. Fear for the child, for the fragile peace she and Theron had just begun to build. But then, looking at Theron's resolute face, a different emotion began to surface. A slow-burning anger. She was the queen of Eredor. This was her home, her child, her future. She would not allow a man like Kaelen to poison it with whispers and lies. "Then we will not let him find any weakness to exploit," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We will show them all a united front. We will be the image of strength and stability." A flicker of admiration, of surprise, crossed his face. He stepped closer, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool room. "He will try to isolate you. To make you feel the sting of the court's judgment again." "I endured 7 years of their whispers about being barren," she replied, a hint of steel in her tone. "I can endure a few more about a miracle. The difference is, this time, I know I am not alone." The words hung in the air between them, a quiet, powerful declaration. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before coming to rest on her abdomen, his touch so gentle it was barely a pressure. It was the first time he had ever touched her this way, a direct, deliberate acknowledgement of the new life that connected them. His palm was broad and warm, a shield against the world. Just then, a tiny, definitive kick met his hand. A flutter against his palm, a secret message from their child. Theron's breath hitched. A look of profound wonder, of pure, unguarded awe, transformed his features. All the kingly fury, the political strategist, the haunted son. It all melted away, leaving only a father feeling his child's life for the first time. He looked from her belly to her eyes, and in that shared moment, something fundamental shifted. The truce, the alliance, it was no longer enough. This was the beginning of a true bond, forged not by a potion or a crown, but by the shared fierce and protective love for the child they would bring into the world. "We will protect him," Theron whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "He did not say the heir. He said him." "Her," Elara countered softly, a small smile playing on her lips for the first time that day. "Them," he amended, his own smile finally breaking through the tension. "We will protect them. Together." The unseen war had been declared, but in that small, quiet room, they had found their most powerful weapon, each other. Chapter 12, A Sister's Atonement. While the king and queen forged a new alliance in the fire of Kaelen's threats, Isolde languished in a self-imposed exile of guilt. The joy she had expected to feel at the news of Elara's pregnancy was a poisoned chalice. She had given her sister her heart's desire, but she had shattered their trust to do it. The distance between them was a physical pain, a constant, dull ache in her chest. She saw the renewed whispers in the court, heard the venomous honeyed words of Lord Kaelen at the formal dinners, and knew with a sickening certainty that this danger was her fault. She had unleashed this chaos. Her desperate, misguided magic had created a seam of weakness in the fabric of the monarchy, and Kaelen was now pulling at the threads. Consumed by a desperate need to atone, she turned back to the one thing she knew best, her magic. But this time, it would not be a tool of manipulation. It would be a shield, a lamp in the darkness. She avoided the grand, potent spells of compulsion. Instead, she retreated to the forgotten corners of the royal archives, seeking out the subtle, observational magics. Scrying, listening spells, potions that enhanced perception. She spent her nights poring over ancient texts, her fingers stained with ink and the dust of ages. She was no longer trying to change fate, but simply to understand the threats that now circled her family. Her first breakthrough came from a simple listening spell, one that allowed her to attune her hearing to the whispers carried on the draughts of the castle. It was a dizzying, chaotic power, but by focusing on Kaelen's name, she began to piece together fragments of his plan. She heard two of his guards, emboldened by ale in a secluded alcove, boasting of their lord's cunning. They spoke of a genealogist Kaelen kept on his staff, a man tasked with tracing the forgotten, lesser branches of Eredor's royal family tree. This was more than a simple desire to cause trouble. This was a calculated search for a weapon. Driven by a new urgency, Isolde dared a more dangerous magic. A scrying ritual, using a silver bowl filled with water from a sacred spring, mixed with a drop of her own blood to bind the spell to her family. The ritual was draining, leaving her pale and trembling, but as she stared into the shimmering water, images began to form. She saw Kaelen in his chambers, not with a woman, but with a shadowy figure, a man in the robes of a disavowed order of monks known for their skill in forgery. Kaelen was handing the man a heavy purse of gold, and in return, the monk passed him a scroll of aged parchment. Though she could not see the writing, she knew in her bones what it was, a lie, being crafted into a history. The final piece fell into place a few nights later. She brewed a potion of clarity, a bitter, earthy draught that sharpened the senses to an almost painful degree. She followed a servant she knew to be in Kaelen's pay, her own movements silenced by a simple cantrip. She watched as the servant delivered a message to a stable hand, who then rode out under the cover of darkness. Isolde knew the route, a little-used path leading south. She understood. Kaelen was not just building a case within the castle, he was sending out messages, planting the seeds of his poisonous story among the southern lords, those already nursing old grudges against the crown. He was building an army of doubt. Guilt warred with a fierce, protective instinct. She had to warn them. She could no longer hide in the shadows of her shame. Her magic had caused this wound, and now, her magic had uncovered the dagger meant to be plunged into it. Taking a deep breath, clutching the notes she had compiled, a desperate offering of loyalty, she walked to the king's study, the same room where Elara and Theron had forged their new bond. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear and resolve. This was her chance, not just to save her sister, but to save herself. Chapter 13, Whispers in the Walls. Kaelen's assault was a masterclass in subtlety. There were no more public provocations, no more barbs thrown across the council table. Instead, he waged his war in the shadows, his weapons of choice the half-glance, the hushed word, the carefully planted seed of doubt. The very walls of the castle seemed to absorb his poison and breathe it back out into the corridors. For Elara, it was a return to a familiar kind of torment, but with a more sinister edge. The whispers that had once called her Barren were now replaced with something far more insidious. She would enter a room, and the light chatter of her ladies-in-waiting would cease abruptly. A courtier would bow, but their eyes would flick down to her swelling abdomen with a look that was not celebratory, but speculative. The term miracle, which Kaelen had used with such venom, began to circulate, its meaning twisted from a blessing into a question. One afternoon, a young, ambitious lady-in-waiting named Lady Seraphina was helping Elara with her embroidery. "It is such a blessing, Your Majesty," she said, her voice sweet as honeyed wine. "After so many years of prayers. The gods truly do work in mysterious ways. Some are even calling the child the solstice heir, conceived in the darkest part of the year, a sudden light. almost as if by magic. The word hung in the air, shimmering with unspoken accusation. Elara's needle froze, her knuckles white. She looked at Seraphina, at the feigned innocence in her wide eyes, and saw Kaelen's influence as clearly as if he were standing behind the girl, whispering in her ear. The old Elara would have retreated, her pain a private burden. The new Elara, the queen fighting for her child, met the girl's gaze with a look of cold, regal authority. The only magic involved, Lady Seraphina, was the sacred bond of marriage, a subject I'm sure you know little about. You are dismissed. The girl scurried away, her face burning with shame, but the encounter left Elara shaken. The poison was spreading faster than she had realized. Kaelen was turning her miracle into a scandal, her joy into a source of suspicion. She felt increasingly isolated, the glittering court becoming a claustrophobic cage of watching eyes. Theron did his best to shield her. He was a constant, solid presence at her side. He dismissed Lady Seraphina from court service the very next day, sending a clear message that disloyalty to the queen would not be tolerated. He held her hand during state dinners, his thumb rubbing soothing circles on her skin, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. But they both knew it was like trying to dam a river with stones. For every rumor they quelled, two more seemed to spring up in its place. Kaelen had expertly tapped into the court's appetite for intrigue, turning their own home into a hostile territory. The very air felt thick with suspicion. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her chambers, Elara walked in the moonlit gardens. The cold, crisp air was a welcome relief. She heard voices from a nearby terrace, two lords of the council, men who had sworn fealty to Theron. But if the child is not of the king's blood, one began, his voice low. Hush, man. Treasonous talk, the other chided, though without much force. Still, 7 years is a long time. And Lord Kaelen's genealogist has apparently uncovered some interesting anomalies in the line of succession. Elara froze behind a thicket of winter roses, her heart turning to ice. It was worse than she imagined. Kaelen wasn't just spreading gossip, he was building a legalistic argument against her child's legitimacy. He was providing the lords with a political and moral justification to doubt their king, to question the very foundation of his rule. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were the first tremors of a political earthquake, and she and her unborn child were standing at its epicenter. Chapter 14. The Price of a Secret. Elara was still reeling from the conversation she'd overheard in the garden when a page informed her that Princess Isolde requested an audience with both her and the king in his private study. Her first instinct was weary refusal. She had no strength for another painful confrontation with her sister. But Theron, seeing the troubled look on her face, placed a hand on her arm. Let us hear her, he said quietly. Whatever this is, we will face it together. When they entered the study, they found Isolde standing by the map table, not with tears in her eyes, but with a fierce, focused intensity. She was pale and looked as if she hadn't slept in days, but the guilt that had haunted her had been burned away, replaced by a grim resolve. Spread across the table were notes, star charts, and a hastily drawn map. She didn't begin with an apology. She began with a warning. Lord Kaelen is not just spreading rumors. He is preparing to challenge the succession. She laid out everything she had discovered with a speed and clarity that commanded their attention. She spoke of the genealogist, the forger monk, and the messages being sent to the southern lords. He is constructing a false history, she explained, her finger tracing a line on her crude map. He has found a distant ancestor, a third son from 3 centuries ago who married into a southern house. His forger is creating documents to prove this line has a stronger claim than any child born of a questionable conception. He plans to present this to the southern lords, to create a schism in the kingdom, and then offer himself as a unifying, legitimate alternative. The scope of his treason was breathtaking. He was engineering a civil war, with her unborn child as the spark. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Elara looked at the evidence, at the desperate, intelligent light in her sister's eyes, and understood. Isolde's magic, the very force that had started this nightmare, had now become their only tool to see inside their enemy's mind. I am so sorry, Elara, Isolde finally whispered, her composure crumbling. Tears welled in her eyes. I see that now. My desire to give you happiness put you, your child, and the entire kingdom in jeopardy. I broke our trust to give you a child. Please. Let me use my gifts now to protect that child. To protect our family. The apology was not an excuse or a plea, but a vow. Elara crossed the room and took her sister's hands. They were cold and trembling. You made a terrible mistake, Isolde, she said softly, her own tears beginning to fall. But it was born from love. And what you have done now, you have risked much to bring us this truth. You have given us a fighting chance. She squeezed her sister's hands. There is nothing to forgive. We are sisters. We will face this together. Theron had watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. Now, he stepped forward and looked down at Isolde's notes. He saw not the wild magic he had always distrusted, but a keen strategic mind. You have given us the one thing we lacked, Isolde, he said, his voice filled with a new respect. Foreknowledge. Kaelen thinks he is moving pieces in the dark, but you have just lit a torch. The three of them stood around the table, the queen, the king, and the princess sorceress. The wounds of the past were not gone, but they had been set aside. The fractured family was whole again, united by a common threat. Kaelen had intended to isolate and destroy them. Instead, he had forged them into a weapon he would never see coming. They were no longer reacting to his whispers, they were preparing to answer them with thunder. Chapter 15, The King's Gambit. Armed with Isolde's intelligence, the atmosphere in the king's study shifted from defensive worry to calculated offense. Kaelen's plan relied on secrecy, on his ability to cultivate doubt in the shadows until it was strong enough to survive the light of day. Theron, with Elara and Isolde at his side, decided they would not give him the shadows to hide in. They would drag his entire conspiracy into the light. He wants to question my heir's legitimacy, Theron said, his fist resting on the map table. He wants to force the lords to choose a side. Very well. We will force them to choose now, before his lies have taken root. The plan they devised was both audacious and brilliant in its simplicity. Theron announced he would be holding a grand ceremony in the throne room in 3 days' time. He was formally investing his unborn child with the title Prince or Princess of the Northern Spire, a title second only to the crown itself. It was an ancient, rarely used custom, a public and sacred blessing that would bind every lord in the kingdom to the child through a renewed oath of fealty. The announcement sent a shockwave through the court. To name and invest an heir before birth was unprecedented in recent history. It was a bold, unequivocal statement of certainty and power. Invitations were sent to every noble house, their attendance not requested but required. To refuse would be a blatant act of defiance. Kaelen was caught completely off guard. He had expected months to quietly sow his discord. Instead, he was being forced into a public declaration. If he attended the ceremony and swore the oath, he would be publicly acknowledging the heir, making his claims of illegitimacy look like the treasonous backpedaling of a spurned courtier. If he refused to attend or swear the oath, he would expose his treacherous intentions to the entire kingdom before his support was solidified. Theron had turned Kaelen's own game against him, forcing his hand. The 3 days leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind of activity and tension. Elara and Theron worked as a seamless team. She oversaw the preparations, the draperies of royal blue and silver, the placement of the ancient ceremonial cradle, ensuring every detail projected an aura of unshakable tradition and legitimacy. Theron met with his most loyal lords, shoring up support, his quiet confidence a bulwark against the remaining whispers. Isolde, meanwhile, used her subtle magics to watch Kaelen, reporting on his frantic, secret meetings as he tried to rally support for a boycott that was failing to materialize. The trap was set. On the day of the ceremony, the throne room was filled to capacity. Light from the high arched windows streamed down, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. Every great lord and lady of Eredor was present, their fine silks and jewels a glittering tapestry of the kingdom's power. A palpable tension hung in the air, a sense of history being made. Elara stood beside the twin thrones, radiant in a gown of creamy white that proudly displayed her pregnancy. She was no longer a victim of whispers but a queen claiming her legacy. Theron, in his full state regalia, the solstice crown on his head, looked every inch the formidable king he was. He stood and the room fell silent. His voice rang with power and clarity, echoing off the stone walls. He spoke of continuity, of the future of the kingdom, of the joy and certainty with which he and his queen awaited their child. Then, he gave the signal. The high priest, a man with a beard as white as snow, stepped forward, holding a sacred text. He began the ancient rite of blessing. At the climax of the ceremony, he would call each lord forward to renew their oath, to swear their life and loyalty not just to the king, but to his named heir. Elara's gaze swept the crowd and found Lord Kaelen. He stood amongst the other dignitaries, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He was trapped. The entire court was watching him. The future of the kingdom hung on this single moment. The high priest's voice droned on, building toward the inevitable call. Elara held her breath, her hand finding Theron's. What would Kaelen do? Would he bend the knee, or would he break? Chapter 16. The Oath and the Exile. The high priest's voice, ancient and resonant, seemed to make the very stones of the throne room vibrate. He called the name of the first duke, a grizzled old warrior who strode forward without hesitation, knelt before the thrones, and swore his fealty to the unborn heir with a voice like grinding rock. One by one, the great lords and ladies of the north followed, their oaths a rising chorus of loyalty that solidified the foundation of Theron's rule with every word. Elara's heart beat a steady rhythm against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed forward, a serene and confident queen, but from the corner of her eye, she watched Kaelen. He stood rigid, his face a pale mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He had been so certain of his victory, so sure that his web of whispers would ensnare the throne. Now, that web was being systematically torn apart before his eyes. With every oath sworn, his position became more untenable. He was being utterly, publicly outmaneuvered. Finally, only a few southern dignitaries remained. The priest called, Lord Kaelen of the Sunken Isles. A collective, indrawn breath seemed to suck the air from the room. This was the moment. Every eye was on the golden-haired ambassador. For a heart-stopping second, he did not move. Elara saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes, a wild impulse to shout his treason for all to hear. But he was a strategist, and he saw the checkmate. He was surrounded by a sea of northern lords loyal to their king. To defy the oath now would be suicide. With a movement so stiff it looked painful, he stepped forward. He walked the long aisle toward the dais, his graceful stride gone, replaced by the heavy tread of a condemned man. He sank to one knee, the rich velvet of his tunic brushing the cold stone floor. He would not look at Elara or Theron, his gaze fixed on the floor in front of him. "I, Lord Kaelen," he began, his voice tight and strained, strangled by the humiliation, "do swear my fealty and my sword to the named heir of Eredor, the prince or princess of the Northern Spire. I pledge to defend this sacred line, so help me the gods." The words were correct, but the venom with which he spoke them was a poison in the air. He had bent the knee, but he had not been broken. He had merely been caged. When the last oath was sworn, Theron stood once more. He did not look at Kaelen, but his words were clearly meant for him. "We thank you all for this display of unity. It is this strength that keeps our kingdom safe, not only from foreign armies but from the more insidious threat of division from within." Then, he did something no one expected. He addressed Kaelen directly, his voice calm and carrying a lethal finality. "Lord Kaelen, we thank you for your service as ambassador. Your duties here are concluded. A ship has been prepared to escort you back to the Sunken Isles at first light. We wish you a swift and final journey home." It was not an accusation. It was a dismissal. A public, unequivocal exile. He was stripping Kaelen of his power and influence, casting him out before he could whisper another word of poison. Kaelen looked up, his face ashen with shock and fury. He had been beaten, disarmed, and banished in a single, perfectly executed gambit. He rose, bowed stiffly, and walked from the throne room without another word, the weight of 100 pairs of hostile eyes on his back. That night, alone in their chambers, the adrenaline of the day finally receded, leaving behind a profound sense of relief. Theron took Elara's hand, raising it to his lips. His touch was no longer hesitant but sure and filled with a deep, reverent affection. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice low. You were every inch a queen today. We were, she corrected him softly, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw. The rough stubble of his beard was a surprisingly intimate texture against her palm. Today, I finally understood what it means to rule. It is not just about wearing a crown. It is about protecting what you love. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. I have been a fool for 7 years, Elara. I was so busy protecting you from a cage, I never realized I was the one locking the door. What I feel for you, it is not duty. I think it may be the very thing I was trying to shield you from. In the quiet of the room, with the threat banished and their child safe in her womb, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. This was no longer a truce or an alliance. It was a beginning, born from the ashes of a conspiracy, a love story finally being written after 7 years of empty pages. Chapter 17, The Calm and the Coming Storm. The exile of Lord Kaelen washed a wave of cleansing peace over the court. The whispers ceased, replaced by the cheerful, earnest buzz of a kingdom secure in its future. The solstice air was no longer a term of suspicion, but one of endearment and hope. Winter's hold on the land began to weaken, the first green shoots of spring pushing through the thawing earth in the castle gardens, a mirror of the new life burgeoning in Elara's womb. The months that followed were the most contented of Elara's life. The tentative affection between her and Theron blossomed into a deep and abiding love. He was a constant, attentive presence. They walked together daily, his pace slowed to match her own, his arm a steady support as her pregnancy advanced. They no longer needed safe, polite topics of conversation. They spoke of everything, their fears, their dreams for their child, their regrets for the years they had lost to misunderstanding. He would read to her in the evenings by the fire, his voice a low, soothing rumble as he recounted the histories of the kings before him. But often, he would put the book down and simply watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face. I spent so long seeing only a crown, he confessed one night, his hand resting gently on her belly, that I nearly missed the woman who was meant to be the heart of my entire world. Elara, in turn, saw the man she had always hoped existed beneath the remote, disciplined facade. She saw his humor, his unwavering sense of justice, and the profound tenderness he reserved only for her. Her love for him was fierce and protective, a quiet joy that filled the empty spaces in her heart. Isolde, too, found a new place within their small family. Her guilt had been replaced by a quiet dedication. Her magic, once a tool of impulsive interference, was now a shield. She wove subtle wards of protection around Elara's chambers and used her scrying bowl not to pry, but to watch the coastlines, a silent guardian against the lingering threat from the south. The bond between the sisters was different now, forged in fire and tempered by truth, it was stronger than it had ever been. Yet, as the birth drew nearer, a shadow of unease began to creep back in. Theron doubled the patrols along the southern coast and sent his most trusted spies to the sunken isles. Their reports were unsettling. Kaelen was not languishing in his disgrace. He was amassing a fleet of mercenary ships under the guise of trade protection. He was using his family's wealth to buy the loyalty of disgraced lords and desperate men. He had been publicly shamed, and his vendetta had festered from a political ambition into a burning, personal hatred. One evening, a royal scout, half dead from exhaustion, arrived at the castle. He had intercepted a message, not a formal letter, but a coded symbol, a scorched hawk's feather, being passed among a small, disloyal faction of southern lords. Isolde, examining the feather, recognized the dark magic woven into it. It was a call to arms, a signal to be ready. He plans to strike, Theron said, his face grim as they stood over the map in his study. He knows the kingdom will be at its most vulnerable, its most distracted, during the birth of the heir. The calm was over. The peace had been a temporary reprieve, a deep breath before the plunge. Kaelen was not just a disgraced courtier, he was a serpent coiling in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the kingdom. The birth of their child would not just be a moment of joy, it would be the backdrop for the final brutal battle for the future of Eredor. The storm Kaelen had been gathering was about to break upon their shores. Chapter 18, The Longest Night. The first pain came just after dusk, a sharp, insistent clenching deep in Elara's back. She had been sitting with Theron, a quiet game of chess between them, when she drew a sharp breath. He was by her side in an instant, his face a mask of concern. "Elara." She gave him a watery, reassuring smile. "It would seem, Your Majesty, that your heir is impatient." The castle, which had been on a quiet state of high alert for weeks, sprang into controlled, efficient action. The midwives were summoned, the royal chambers secured, and the guards on the battlements were quietly doubled. Theron, dismissing the protocol that dictated a king should remain outside, refused to leave her side. He held her hand, wiped the sweat from her brow with a cool cloth, and murmured words of encouragement, his voice a steady anchor in the rising sea of her pain. Hours bled into one another. The longest night of their lives stretched into an eternity. Elara's world narrowed to the room, to the rhythm of her own body, to the reassuring pressure of Theron's hand in hers. She fought with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a primal, fierce determination to bring her child safely into the world. As the moon reached its zenith, a different kind of tension began to grip the castle. From her post in the highest tower, Isolde felt it first. A sudden, violent disruption in the wards she had placed along the coast. It was like a string snapping taut, a magical alarm bell ringing in her soul. She grabbed her scrying bowl, her hands moving with frantic urgency. The water shimmered, and an image appeared, a fleet of ships, their sails black against the moonlit water, moving swiftly, silently, toward a secluded cove a few miles down the coast. Kaelen had come. She ran, her robes flying behind her, to the royal chambers, her message a stark, whispered warning to the captain of the guard. The castle lockdown became absolute. The clang of the portcullis dropping echoed through the stone corridors. Inside the birthing room, the outside world ceased to exist. All that mattered was the final, monumental effort. With a cry that was equal parts agony and triumph, Elara gave one last push. A new sound filled the room, the strong, indignant wail of a healthy baby. "A son," the midwife announced, her voice filled with joyful relief. "You have a prince, Your Majesty." She placed the small, squirming bundle into Elara's waiting arms. He was perfect. A tuft of dark hair like Theron's, and eyes that, when they blinked open, seemed to hold the deep, thoughtful blue of his mother's. Tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down Elara's face. She looked at Theron, and the love that passed between them was a palpable, radiant force. He leaned down and kissed her, then gently touched his son's cheek with a calloused finger, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. All the pain, all the fear, all the years of waiting, it was all worth it for this one perfect moment. And then, the moment was shattered. From the courtyard below came a sudden, violent crash, followed by the splintering of wood and the terrified shouts of men. A single brazen horn blast cut through the night. Not the sound of the royal guard, but a foreign, warlike cry. The door to the chamber burst open, and the captain of the guard stood there, his face grim, his sword already drawn. "Your Majesty," he said to Theron, "the eastern gate has been breached. We are under attack." The joy in the room instantly turned to ice. Terror, cold and sharp, seized Elara's heart. Kaelen had timed his assault with monstrous precision, striking at the exact moment of their greatest joy and their greatest vulnerability. The longest night was far from over. The battle for their son's life had only just begun. Chapter 19, Fire and Fealty. The joy of his son's first cry still echoed in his ears as the harsh reality of war crashed down upon Theron. For one wild, desperate moment, he wanted to stay, to form a wall with his own body around his wife and newborn child. But he saw the plea in Elara's eyes, a look not of fear for herself, but of unwavering belief in him. "Go," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. She clutched their son, Lien, closer to her chest. "You are their king. Protect our kingdom. We will be safe here." Her strength was his own. He kissed her one last time, a hard, desperate press of his lips, and then kissed his son's forehead. He turned to the captain of the guard, the loving father vanishing, replaced instantly by the formidable, battle-hardened monarch. "Barricade this corridor. No one gets through. No one." He strode from the room, his hand already on the hilt of his sword. The castle was a cacophony of chaos. Kaelen's mercenaries, having used a powerful battering ram at the eastern gate while the main guard was focused on the primary entrance, had poured into the lower courtyard. They were outnumbered, but they fought with a desperate ferocity, their goal not to conquer the castle, but to fight their way to the royal chambers, to the queen and the heir. Theron's presence on the grand staircase was like a lightning strike. His voice, roaring commands, cut through the din, organizing the frantic guards into a disciplined defensive line. He was not a king directing from the rear, he was a warrior, his blade a blur of silver as he met the first wave of attackers, his movements a deadly, precise dance. Meanwhile, in the tower, Isolde knew that swords alone might not be enough. She drew on her power, not for destruction, but for deception. She cast a powerful illusion over the main courtyard, making the ground appear to ripple and heave like a stormy sea. Mercenaries faltered, their footing unsure, their minds tricked by a landscape that seemed to betray them. It was enough to break their momentum, to give Theron's guards the precious seconds they needed to regroup and push them back. Theron fought his way toward the breached gate, knowing he had to cut off the head of the serpent. He found Kaelen near the shattered remnants of the gate, not fighting the common soldiers, but directing his men, a look of triumphant madness on his face. When he saw Theron, his lips curled into a snarl of pure hatred. "Theron!" he screamed over the clash of steel. "I've come for what is mine. Your throne, your kingdom, and your whore's bastard." The insult was a spark to gunpowder. Theron's cold, controlled fury erupted into a white-hot rage. He lunged, and their duel began, a vortex of violence in the midst of the larger battle. Kaelen was skilled and fueled by years of resentment, his attacks wild and powerful. But Theron was fighting for more than revenge. He was fighting for his wife, for his son, for every stone and every soul in the kingdom he loved. His discipline was his shield, his love his strength. He parried a clumsy, rage-fueled swing from Kaelen, using his opponent's momentum to twist his blade and disarm him. Kaelen's sword clattered across the cobblestones. He stood, defenseless and panting, his mad dream of conquest collapsing around him. "It's over, Kaelen," Theron said, his sword point at Kaelen's throat. With the defeat of their leader, the remaining mercenaries lost their will to fight. They were quickly surrounded and subdued. The battle was won. Theron did not kill Kaelen in the courtyard. Death would be too clean an escape. "Take him to the black cells," he commanded the guards. "He will live out his days in darkness, with nothing but the memory of his failure for company." Bloodied, bruised, and utterly exhausted, Theron made his way back through the quieted halls to the royal chambers. When the barricade was removed and he stepped inside, he saw Elara, safe, sitting in a chair with their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. Isolde stood guard by the window, her face pale but her eyes shining with relief. Elara looked up, and the smile she gave him was the most beautiful sunrise he had ever seen. He knelt before her, and she reached out, her hand gently touching the cut on his cheek. The war was over. The fealty of his kingdom had been proven in fire and blood. He was a king, a husband, and now, a father. His family was safe. His kingdom was secure. Chapter 20, The Solstice Heir. 1 month later, the spring equinox arrived, bathing the kingdom of Eredor in the gentle golden light of a new season. The scars on the castle were healing, the splintered wood of the eastern gate had been replaced, and the sounds of masons' hammers echoed in the courtyard, a rhythm of repair and renewal. The brief, violent reign of Terra Kaelen had unleashed already felt like a dark dream from another lifetime. The true renewal, however, was not in the stone, but in the heart of the castle, in the royal nursery. The room was bathed in morning sun, and the air was filled with the sweet, clean scent of a newborn. Elara sat in a rocking chair, humming a soft lullaby to Prince Lien, who was nestled in her arms, his tiny fists curled against the soft linen of his blanket. She had never known a contentment so profound, so complete. The 7 years of aching loneliness, the whispers of the court, the pain of deception, it had all been a long dark winter leading to this glorious spring. Her son, the solstice heir, conceived in the darkest part of the year, had brought the light back into her world. The door opened softly, and Theron entered. He was not dressed in his formal regalia or his battle-worn leather, but in a simple tunic. He had come not as a king, but as a husband and father. He smiled as he saw them, the lines of weariness around his eyes from the long weeks of rebuilding the kingdom's security softening at the sight of his family. He knelt by the chair, his presence a familiar comfort. He reached out and gently stroked Lien's cheek with his finger. The baby stirred, his little mouth making a soft noise. Who would have thought, Elara whispered, her gaze moving from her son to her husband, that a marriage of cold duty could lead to a love like this? Theron took her free hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. It was never loveless, Elara, he said, his voice low and filled with a truth that resonated deep in her soul. Only silent. I was a fool, so bound by a promise to the dead that I couldn't see the life waiting right in front of me. You taught me that honor without love is just an empty cage. Their journey had been a crucible, burning away the misunderstandings, the pride and the fear, leaving only the pure, unbreakable bond between them. A light knock came at the door, and Isolde peeked in, her face bright with a joyful, unburdened smile. "Is the future of the kingdom awake?" she whispered playfully. She crossed the room and looked down at her nephew, her eyes soft with love. Her magic, once a source of chaos, was now a protective blanket, a gift she used to soothe the baby's colics and warm his room on chilly nights. She was whole again, her place in their family secure and cherished. The three of them stood together, a portrait of a family forged in adversity, their love the true magic that had saved them all. Theron leaned down and kissed Elara, a kiss of quiet gratitude and deep, enduring love. Looking at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms, Elara finally understood. The Barren Queen was a ghost of the past. She was a mother, a beloved wife, and a queen whose strength had been tested and proven. The kingdom was safe, the air was thriving, and the love that filled the sunlit room, unbroken by curses, politics, or separations, was the truest and most lasting inheritance of all.